When we think about the upcoming slate of Disney movies, one can't help but notice the fact that it's completely consisting of sequels, whether it be from the live-action films to their own animation and Pixar, most of which seem to be great news for fans of the works given their successful financial track records for those very films, but also very disappointing looking at it. Because if you know someone like me, then you know how hard I rail against Disney sequels for their quality where no improvements are made to the stories and are generally incoherent messes, beginning with the fact that most were just made for DVD and only long pilots of their TV series that either did or did not exist. Like looking back on that history and what Walt himself believed in not topping pigs with pigs, Disney has been massively cursed with doing sequels no matter what is attempted to do. And that's what this video is trying to address in the problem with films released like Moana 2 and Zootopia 2, and what they mean moving forward that doesn't really help resolve their major issues happening with the company right now. Ones that involve things that weren't intended to be one way and now framed as the next alongside a slate of films that don't need to exist, or just too lazy to even justify their own existence for something that should be unique if that route is to be desired. Because even while I still remain cautiously optimistic about the next slate of movies including Moana 2 that was haphazardly thrown in to be released this year in 2024, their history still prove how bad they are at making these very sequels and the problem we need to address. The problem of always having good ideas but never executing them properly at all to fill in the necessary time slots for the executives to fulfill their shareholders' pockets, like what they did recently with the announcements to act as a temporary boost. But still going back and forth again, I just really do wish they can have a good sequel because I know that they can make one. I've seen other studios like DreamWorks create fantastic sequels at various times, other than the ones that are totally awful in my opinion, that showed us that things can exist for them to create, compared to my favorite studio that produces a consistent line of unfinished products that makes it worse and difficult to protect in a damaged brand. So starting out with our newly presented problem, we have to start back at the very beginning. This again brings us to the time of the Three Little Pigs with Walt Disney making short cartoons during the Depression era before Snow White. They were very popular since they resonated with audiences at the time, where they wanted to make another one, where of course it was still kind of successful but never reached the same height as the first, where Walt thought you couldn't top pigs with pigs, frustrated with the response and what came out of it, wanting to look forward to newer projects rather than rely on what he did, where you can see for the most part in their main films and animation that we all love today, none of them were sequels, focusing on the next big idea that he could have rather than rely on what already worked. Now this isn't to say that they were out of the question or he absolutely hated the idea of sequels, since he did have one in the works for Mary Poppins and meant he was still open to things, but that was unfortunately shut down for a long time as the original author of P.O. Travers refused to have him make any more content surrounding Mary Poppins since she didn't like that, where as a result, Disney would not return to such ideas again until the Renaissance with a sequel to The Rescuers. Which of course brings us to our first instance of mainstream Disney sequels, where it was introduced by Katzenberg and Eisner after they came into the company to restart Disney Animation, doing something with one of the more popular films in the dark age of animation, where as a result, they released this film during the start of the Renaissance wedged in between the two giants of Beauty and the Beast and The Little Mermaid, the two of which we all recognize today rather than the one I'm just mentioning, where it turned out to be a decent movie that unfortunately fell short of the studio's expectations. And as a result of that, Katzenberg decided to pull all the advertising for the film's release, thinking it was over, that the film didn't make as much money as they needed, and the movie just didn't work for them, even if it was still a modest success in some countries and introduced digital animation to the industry moving forward. I mean, looking back on it now, the movie still isn't quite memorable for its characters compared to the original either, less involved other than the fact that they had a good villain that saved it, where it showed that this was just a product made in the response to new management in this new era. Nothing great or fancy to become remarkable for a sequel that generally didn't even need to exist looking back on it, pulling the plug on sequels for Disney Animation at this time yet again until the direct-to-DVD division picked that up instead. I covered this section many times before, where these were just terrible films that were generally just pilots for their TV shows and nothing more than that in the era of Disney Channel's early years, where executives like Eisner really actually didn't think this was a good idea either, and neither did animation head Peter Schneider at the time. But anyways, they still did it, where most of the films stayed out of the mainstream spotlight, but were still there for us to grow up watching. They were still successes on DVD, where most of us remember what they were. And unfortunately, growing up, most of them just honestly movies suck regardless of our own feelings on some of them. They just weren't actually good movies at all and were meant to be brands that us kids loved, giving us more content for them and reasons for those shows to be made. Where the main point you get here is the fact that Disney did not know how to make a great sequel. They kinda shied away from this fact of making good ones for the most part, with the exception of a few that I have mentioned or ones that you may like. That they had this sort of spirit that stopped them from making a good film after their initial success. I mean, again, this was mostly direct-to-DVDs that were successful in doing so after that stint from The Rescuers Down Under, but just still not good quality-wise. The management just literally pulled the plug from any thought of adding a sequel until they started buying more properties, with the rise of Pixar of course coming in. Because at the same time, Disney did make a deal with Pixar before they bought it, giving way for Toy Story that was a huge success and spurned the 3D era we all know of, where they wanted to have a sequel and Disney accepted that due to the success of Aladdin on DVD, making over $100 million in profits, wanting to continue that train and see what they could do, because of the fact that the actual original filmmakers wanted to do so. Or besides its almost troubled production, it again was still a very successful film that some even consider to be better than the original, making way for a new argument that sequels could be good if done right, capped off yet again by the perfect finale with Toy Story 3 that closed off Pixar's golden age in 2010 with the power as the animation studio, while Disney's own animation was experimenting again with 3D in the last legs of 2D. This was when we entered a new era of the sequels for Pixar with their other franchises and the time that Disney gradually rose to unprecedented success in the revival era of animation with films like Wreck-It Ralph and then Frozen making over $1 billion. I mean, of course not Wreck-It Ralph in that regard, but mentioning those two movies that came out after each other is where Disney's new sequel era would actually finally begin, after Moana was released and how they would be generally financially successful, resulting in the first sequels for the studio being made since The Rescuers Down Under. This was due to the fact that the directors of the first Wreck-It Ralph already had ideas for the sequel before that film was even released, thinking of ways to explore the world of gaming much more with various ideas tossed out. And initially for what has been posted, it was generally a positive response before people did point out the fact that it destroyed a lot about the first film with the direction the characters took, where instead of a good sequel, they just went to the internet and forgot everything that made them the way that they are to begin with. Because when you look at a film like Ralph Breaks the Internet for a sequel, there's just so much that was so wrong about this film that I find baffling that this was the story released in the first place, because it ruined everything we loved about it and its world that made the film age worse as time goes on compared to the first that still is enjoyable a decade after its release. But again, it still did marginally better than the first in terms of its box office, where Disney still put in more movies into the works that would be sequels to popular films because of the fact of the brand appeal happening for other franchises like Star Wars and Marvel, where evidently just like the first time, Frozen again just followed up Ralph with Frozen 2, a highly anticipated movie by how big it was because of the success of Frozen, resulting in another box office billion-dollar hit and the second highest grossing animated film to date. But yet again with this film was confused and muddled with so many unfinished narratives and plots that resulted in a complete mess. Not a bad film that really sucks, but just a film that isn't good by normal definitions compared to its original predecessor. That it had a lot of potential if you look at the stronger details of the film, but sadly got squandered because of what the documentaries like Into the Unknown showed in terms of not having the proper time to work the narrative because of that release schedule. They didn't have the time to actually figure out what was this and what was that because they had to stick to that plan, what the executives wanted to be released, planning films to air to fulfill a certain quarter if you know how films are generally released. We're looking at those two release sequels back to back. It actually showed a massive problem with the films regardless of their earnings. Sure, it's great that most people love this property and extends a lot of positives with it, but the stories just didn't work at all. One sucked and the other one just was lost in the woods somewhere. Where after that, of course, COVID hit and everything was shut down for them, working on things remotely and releasing films that were originals again from Pixar to Disney itself. That after the highs of their sequel era of films that made over billions of dollars, it all just suddenly crashed down, where Disney themselves entered the mud with the management changing or rearranging. And in that time, with the fast return of Bob Iger as CEO, came him announcing a slate of sequels to restore the brand once again to the public, such as Zootopia, Frozen, and of course, Toy Story. That the future direction still pointed that they needed to go back to familiarity since the newer projects and current franchises like Star Wars and Marvel weren't working as well as they hoped. That initial success that spurred them to do sequels for their main animated studios just wasn't working anymore. This points to thinking in terms of Disney animation with Strange World completely bombing and Encanto finding more success on streaming like all the other Pixar movies placed on there with no release, which soon joined in on another disappointment. where the plan seemed to rely more on this sequel energy now than they did before, because that's what they were generally known for, being a company that reached 100 years old with so much properties that they could use. And even though that does sound great for fans of such, it really doesn't feel like a creatively great decision at all, focusing again on properties that made you over $1 billion, speaking of those 3 films, and then finding out where the release of an entire theme land based on one of those films, with the potential split into another sequel when Iger announced Frozen 3 and Frozen 4 in the possible works. A very surprising decision that can or can't happen depending on its success, or just made it much more worse for what to expect, alongside Toy Story 5 that was actually in the air. Where when we look at this new sequel era, we only began with 2 sequels with a break before the rest, to now a potential of 4 being released within the decade. But then of course that wasn't the greatest surprise when we finally found out that this year is when Moana 2 was being released in November of the same year. The one that shocked everyone and stunned most of us, that was never expected at all, announced by Bob yet again during their rallying call and investment into Epic Games. Because when you look at the reality, is the fact that this film was intended to be a series instead released on Disney Plus that was made by their Vancouver studio they opened up to make such content for the streaming service. A fact that can be seen by the information that Lin-Manuel Miranda and the original director team of Musinger and Clements were not involved in this film at all, and they had newer directors and songwriters instead, were retaining the original cast of Auli'i Cravalho and The Rock. It was a surprise because of the fact that the live action film was coming out soon as well, only like a few months after this film would be released, where it actually entered in development at the same very time because it was a series that was going to be released this year and the others that I already knew of. Where the problem I want to present is the fact that this was just dropped like this, compared to the other films that were generally shown or semi-announced near the tail end of the previous year, but now only 9 months as of this time. In the last video I released on the day it came out of the trailer, I questioned what the plan was for this year's movie if this film remained a series. Yes, there was the fact that they did announce Zootopia 2 for next year's film, but it felt like they were more set on having that released later, where it just seems like response that came out of their slate of 2023 box office failures, from Wish being the last disappointment yet again that we just talked about. That from the failure of original films released after the pandemic from either studio Pixar and Disney, they just literally go back to a slate of sequels like Inside Out, Moana, and Zootopia, and Frozen, and Toy Story. And looking at those simple facts, this just feels like a scramble to solve a big problem with the theatrical division, a short-term solution to an even bigger, longer problem in terms of how animated films have not been successful for the most part except for a few, or the oversaturation of their bigger franchises that they bought in. I mean, I still remain hopeful for all of these projects because I love their work, but then just feel so angry and dissatisfied since they haven't proven themselves at all to be competent in the story departments for such ideas in recent times. We can't just let them make films like this and expect to print money at the cost of the story that we generally love. Again, films like Encanto that they released in the past few years that have come out recently still prove they have the ability to produce great films, but have a management that makes it into the exception, wanting to do something familiar and so simple without doing anything new. And this new era they're entering with Moana 2 just seems no different, since it originally was a series but now has to be upgraded into a film. But at least still sounds like a decent journey by the looks of things, with the focus on the new crew that we know of, where as long as they stick to that, it actually can work. You can be great just like DreamWorks did for Puss in Boots, discounting their other crap sequels they've been recently doing, where it gives it a reason for its existence, but then on the other hand, you're just still making it harder for people to trust you when the focus is just on one thing, affected by the ghost of its own past, with Walt saying you can't top pigs with pigs. More like, in this case, putting lipstick on a pig in what they're doing. They're putting a fresh coat of paint onto the properties you already know and seen that feels good but has nothing else to offer, thinking in terms of what happened with The Incredibles 2 that is overall disappointing. Like, they do have one idea that can work on a surface, but they're just not doing enough to justify those existence overall. Because when it actually comes down to it, I do really want to see these sequels. There have been so many films that are sequels that I love even more than the original and are hailed as masterpieces of their own, especially by Disney with the likes of Toy Story and even Tron Legacy in my opinion for live action. But they just never give the time to focus on what they need to do to work anymore, overbloating it to a degree that even Walt knew didn't work and decreases the reputation overall. I really want to believe these films will be great, but they just still don't have the great history to prove such a point. Hence why I still think this is a problem where most of us will be stuck in the middle, with the majority potentially enjoying them on the surface for a good time popcorn movie, but one that still has no real heart or passion for its messages at all. And until they can see that, then nothing they would ever do will ever work at all. And I'm all done, so goodbye.